Assassin's Promise by Thomas Woodward. Chapter 85. Rasham watched as the man's receding back disappeared from view, dust being kicked up in clouds as his horse carried him away from their meeting spot. Rasham grimaced, looking back at the untouched piles of gold coins on the trading table. The fine cloths and silks had indeed taken him in initially. The offer he had given had been more than fair, generous even. Somehow he wondered if the man had any intention from the outset of making a trade. He had hoped to swindle the fool, lulling him with a gleam of gold. However, it was he who had been manipulated in the end. The wind picked up around him, the dry air blowing through his silky garments. The other man had been a master, of that he had no doubt. The name he had given had meant nothing. The man would discard it like a worn feast day mask. Who was he? And why had he chosen to meet? The great merchant guilds had enemies, to be sure. What boiled Rasham's blood most was that he had been on the losing end of the trade. No physical goods had changed hands, but the man had stolen information right from under his nose. Rasham had been unable to pry anything back in return, and he had let the man leave with his head intact. And yet, he could not place him. Yassim Del, if the name was to be believed, had known every intricacy, had observed every rule of etiquette, both those that were obvious and those that remained unspoken. It was maddening. He could not simply kill such a man without proof. The loss of such a talent would be anathema. Much better it would be to bribe or bend the man to the will of the merchant council. He could see the great uses such a man could present. No, he would only dash the man's skull against the rocks as a last resort. He would draw out every measure of such a useful tool before discarding it. With a silent gesture, hand raised halfway to his lips, palms spread out upturned before his gaze, a servant quickly moved before him. The man's eyes were a strange mix of colors, unnatural. The remainder of his face was wrapped in a tightly bound mask of black cloth. Rasham did not make eye contact with the man who stood before him. Rasham waited, unmoving. After a moment, he could sense the fury of the other man before he bowed low and bent a knee to the ground. The sharp intake of breath moved the motes of dust wildly in the air around him. Rasham held his hand low, still not looking at the servant. After a tense moment, the other man gripped it, his hand ending in 4 fingers, one having been sheared away some time ago. A thick scar covered the remains of the knuckle where the finger would have extended from. You will follow this man, Haptal. Discover his secrets. Follow him to his master. After you have gleaned knowledge of all those connected to him and can follow the trail to his masters, then bring the wretch to me, bowed and broken if you must. You will be rewarded by the great blessing of the blind houses. If you fail me, I will take another finger from each of your hands. Go. Haptal rose silently, taking a gold coin from Rasham's fingers. It had been taken from the trading table. Crudely raising the dully gleaming coin to his face, the man pressed it between the folds of dark fabric beneath his eyes, where it disappeared from view. Swinging his gaze back one final time, the tightly muscled servant regarded Rasham with a hateful glare. Rasham clapped his hands once as dust swirled around the 2 figures. When the dust cleared, only Rasham remained. Calmly returning the glittering coins to a heavy pouch, Rasham moved towards the great thoroughfare that connected the great caravans together. A myriad of collapsible wooden structures had been erected, the sun beating down overhead. He could see countless other merchants moving slowly to and fro in the hot desert air. The arid climate never held much draw for him. Rasham despised the heat, but the great vistas that rolled out ahead of their immense group had a grace and wonder that pulled at his blood. He would look forward to meeting the uncultured aristocracy of the far coast. The nobility saw themselves in control, but they were nothing without the lifeblood the merchants afforded them. The power of the guild crushed most opposition. They had unilaterally set the prices for goods. Their power was absolute, save the bravest merchants who refused to join the great guild. Those who refused were slowly wiped from existence, hunted to extinction like animals by the many. Not men, certainly. Abominations were closer to the truth. They raged against their invisible chains, but were loyal nonetheless. He felt a measure of sympathy for any man or woman hunted by the many.